Hey, Shanna.
Hey, hi, Logan. Shauna's here too.
I'm going to put you on mute because I think it transfers to the TV and I can't exactly hear it. Oh, why does it do that? I am recording.
I was telling my son, instead of me working in most of the week,
All right. Okay.
Right.
All right, is everybody ready? So I sent out an email. Next time I may not call this a Bible study because we're not doing so much reading as we are lecturing. So I apologize for that. And this is going to be one of those times. There's not going to be a whole lot of interpretive stuff. I'll be kind of blasting through a bunch of stuff. I also sent an email inviting you to check out some videos I've made before that will help kind of fill in some background. But this is going to be kind of like a wham bam, thank you, ma'am. So everybody should have some hard copy handouts if they like. They were also emailed them. And tonight we're going to be talking about land. And I put a father question mark in Latin, prodeo et patria. Patria is country. Patriotes is something like fatherlings. So patriots are just little pieces of their country. But anyway, and it's a question: from whom do we inherit this land that we call Palestine? And so this week I've titled this session "Praised by Everyone?" The martial landscape of Jesus's ministry. And is that my music or is that outside? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm a little young to start hearing voices, but praised by everyone comes up when Jesus begins his ministry in Nazareth. We'll talk about Nazareth toward the end. But when Jesus begins his ministry, after his baptism and temptation, the Gospels describe the beginning of his ministry in and around his own hometown. And this is important for many reasons, but the reason given by Matthew is that it is foretold by Isaiah 9, Matthew 4:12 through 16. Now, when Jesus heard that John, his relative, had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what would be spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. And Matthew records it this way: land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. I'll remind you of the title of the Bible study. And for those people who sat in the region, the shadow of death, light has dawned. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of our last conclusion session where I'll talk about the transfiguration of soldiers in Scripture. But for now, let's look at Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah 9, verses 1 and 2. And these are both ESV. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, God brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, God has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. And so I've highlighted in the ESV where they're identical, right? And so Matthew, maybe he doesn't have an exact copy, maybe his translation is slightly different, but he kind of paraphrases from Isaiah 9. And Matthew depicts Jesus's temptation followed by John's arrest. And so I've kind of clued you into what I think it means, but what do you hear? What goes through your mind with this language of those in darkness? Have you been told, besides me, who those people may be or what it evokes? The whole world. Like everybody, humanity, all of humanity. Anybody else? And there's some debate as to whether or not this is a prophecy. Matthew seems to think it is, and Matthew has a tendency of seeing prophecies where other people don't see them, including, and I didn't put it in there, but including when he talks about how that they be called Nazareans. There's no prophecy in there, but Matthew is like pointing to something that nobody else is really sure of. Yeah, Karen. The gospel, yeah, it's definitely much more interested in and familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, yeah. So Jesus begins his ministry in Luke. This parallel passage in Luke immediately follows his temptation, and Luke remembers it this way. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. Does anybody remember this tale? Can anybody see the picture and what it looks like? Yeah, so in a nutshell, I'll flash Isaiah 60 in a moment, but he's in his own hometown, and he says, well, you know, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And then he says, surely you will say to me, doctor, heal your family or your children or something. And Jesus says something like, well, a prophet's not welcome in his own land. And he has some really harsh words for the people that he grew up with, and they try and force him off a cliff. They go from everyone praising him for his erudition and articulacy, maybe, and they are insulted eventually, and they want to push him off a cliff. So back to the land. I want to situate it with Jesus' hometown. He's returning to Galilee from, some scholars believe he's been with John for a while. He was baptized, and he's wandering around, kind of learning and experiencing life in Judea. This is Israel, just a topographical map. A lot of the southern portion I've had to crop out to focus on the northern lands, and you'll see that's where a lot of the action happens. Anyway, it's a rough overlay, but here we can see the distribution of land according to the latter half of the book of Joshua, with the Levitical sanctuary cities in red. You can see Kadesh, Golan, Ramoth Gilead, Shechem was a refuge city, Bezer down in Reuben, and then Simeon. Judah has a pretty big portion of land, and Simeon is surrounded on all sides by Judah. You can see the half tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Those were Joseph's sons. Joseph was number 11 of 12, and his two sons become two half tribes. They have a lot of land, which is weird because they're half tribes, as does Ephraim. Ephraim also has quite a bit of land. And then Benjamin has Jerusalem. Can everybody see that in there? And Benjamin was the youngest of the 12. And Benjamin and Joseph were both alike in that they were Rachel's sons. Rachel was Jacob's favored wife, and he was given Leah by her dad and her servant, and then Rachel and her servant were attached later. And so Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh are the half tribes, but more favored in terms of the story of Israel through Joseph. Then you can see Zebulun and Naphtali up in the north, Zebulun in green, Naphtali in yellow. And here's a family tree to remind you, the blue are the sons of Jacob through their different wives, or through his different wives. I think you may know that I would disagree that Jesus is descended from King David. The only biological material comes through Mary, who is described as a daughter of Aaron with her blood relative Elizabeth. That doesn't say he isn't. I mean, I'm sure that, Judah entered his lineage somehow, that's fine. But the story in Luke especially is through Mary. And she is described as a daughter of Aaron, making Jesus of the Levitical tribe. So in a biblical imagination, this is what the land is meant to look like. That's how it's supposed to be divvied out. The tribes each have their own elders and chiefs, with judges occasionally rising up to save Yasa, Israel, from their enemies. Instead, once the time of judges begins, the tribes begin to war against one another. And the bloody, chaotic tribal confederation fails to unify the people. And so maybe we'll try out having a king, right? Everybody remember this from last week? So they give it a whirl, right? And I've gotten rid of the colors because now the tribes are there, their divisions are there, but like everybody just kind of in one kingdom, United Kingdom of Israel now. Saul does a not so great job. David does better. And Solomon at the end, he does, but we can debate that. Saul takes his own life or is killed, depending on the story. He only rules for 27 years. And I've put the approximate dates, according to scholars, down there below in 1037 to 1010. 27 is a random number. 40, however, David's rule is a complete generation. And 40 can signify completeness, totality, fruition. It's like a really good number. And then Solomon is 39, not quite 40, but also not 27. However, you may have heard, and I don't doubt, that Solomon brought prosperity to the land. He was very wise. He settled a dispute between two women who were, argued about whose baby it was by, a very crafty way. However, he builds the first temple with his priest Zadok, and that costs money, right? And herein lies the problem. The money or the cost of that building was raised through taxes, distributed evenly amongst all the people. But anytime you have urban centers under a unified, federalized system, it's not equal, right? The rural poor are getting taxed the exact same as the wealthy urban elites. And so this taxation causes dissension within Israel. The taxes that he implements for his building projects disproportionately harm the rural peasantry who rebel at his death and make the kingdom of Israel, leaving Judah, Benjamin, and Levi as a southern kingdom of Judah. Simeon literally comes out of Judah's tribal lands and goes up and joins the northern tribes. And by calling themselves Israel, the northern tribes are trying to claim themselves as the true embodiment of the biblical story, but without the Davidic bloodline. It's like saying the real America. We are the kingdom of Israel, and that leaves the kingdom of Judah to the south. They set up their own monarchy and their own temple system with shrines in Dan and Bethel. But in 722 BCE, they are overtaken by the Assyrians and they are lost forever. And the southern kingdom, called Judah, survives for another 135 years when Babylon carries most of its most influential Jews into exile in 587. Any questions? This is still pretty simple, but it gets complicated a little bit later. So, why are Zebulun and Naphtali singled out in Isaiah 9 in Matthew's account? Here they are on our trusty map. You can see them at up north. We can zoom in and look a little bit closer. Is that something? Yep. So the simple answer to why Zebulun and Naphtali is that after undergoing this wilderness temptation somewhere in the central arid plains, Jesus is just going home. He's going back to the Galilee, which is the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Nothing special, nothing interesting. Nazareth was, after all, right in the middle of Zebulon's tribal allotment. Capernaum, where Matthew says he leaves Nazareth and sets up shop in Capernaum. That is a fishing village in the land of Naphtali with exactly the kinds of people he was looking for as apostles. But the Bible makes clear that these two tribes in particular represented Israel's ancient military history. So let's begin with the sons of Jacob behind these two Israelite tribes. Zebulon is usually mentioned first because he was the younger of the two. He was the last of Leah's 6 boys and the 10th son of Jacob, whose name means gift, dwelling, or honor. In Genesis 30, verse 20, God has endowed, this is Leah speaking, right? Yeah. God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honor me or zabal me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulon. And this is every son's name they give meaning for. If there's a name in the Bible, look up what it means, because I guarantee you it's fitting into the story somehow. Like King Shaul asked for it, asked for somebody to kill him, and somebody killed him, right? Naphtali was the 6th son of Jacob and the youngest of 2 boys by Bilhah, Rachel's slave. They're relatively nondescript until the time of Judges, when their reputation is solidified as the commando clans of Israel. In the wilderness, Zebulon had been part of the vanguard of Israel as a member of the regiment of Judah. You can see Zebulon at the bottom there on the right. In Numbers 2, it goes over the order of march. And I had to delete this from an earlier session. But what you see is described in Numbers 2, whenever the Israelites settled in a place, whether it was for an hour, a day, a month, or a year, they would set up in camps organized in 4 around the tabernacle, which itself was surrounded by the Levitical clans. The Aaronites, Moses and Aaron, which would represent the high priests, and then the Kohathites, the Merarites, and the Gershonites. They all had different responsibilities surrounding the temple or the tabernacle. And in Numbers 2, it specifically states that Judah, the camp of Judah, there at the top, I've made the heads of the camp a different font. So the camp of Judah includes Judah, Issachar, and Zebulon. They faced east toward the rising sun, same way churches face, the direction of hope, I suppose, right? Then in the north, we had the camp of Dan with Asher and Naphtali with him. To the south, we had the camp of Reuben, joined by Simeon and Gad. And then to the west, we have the favored smaller tribes, Benjamin, Manasseh, in the camp of Ephraim. And I don't know why it was east. It seems to be a pattern that east is somehow, that's always the way we want to face. That's the direction that we're going. So, when the tribes settled in the land, they were the 2 tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali, were the 2 tribes called upon by judges to take up arms and save Israel from her enemies. In Judges 4, people are being oppressed by the Canaanite military commander Sisera, who lived in a place called Harosheth Hagoyim. Harosheth is a city south of the area of this map, and Hagoyim means, who knows? Yeah, the Goyim, the Gentiles, the nations. It was a stand-in, a synonym for non-Jews. So Harosheth Hagoyim is saying this city outside of our borders, not specific, just of the Gentiles. It's a stand-in for the region. Hagoyim is a stand-in for the region within which the city is found. And it's, in places, it can be pejorative, meaning simply the Gentiles, nations, or more bluntly, not Israel, not one of us. I don't remember. I put Judges 4 up here. Oh, yeah. So Judges 4 is when we get into some of the oldest parts of the Bible, which happens to be a Bible. God hears the cry of the people and gives them the prophet Deborah, and she is called Isha Lapidot. No mention of a husband is made, so there's no reason to translate Isha as wife or spouse. Rather, Lapidot means fire. It's most likely she is a fiery woman. Lapidote means flame or torch, and that's exactly what they'll use later with Gideon. The torches were lapidote. Deborah summons Barak, a Naphthalite from the Levitical sanctuary city of Kadesh, right there in the middle of Naphtali. The word here, Kadesh, is literally the holy city of Naphtali. Kadesh is translated as holy into English. Notice that Deborah outranks Barak. She is judge, not him. He is ordered to march on Mount Tabor to contend with Sisera with a force of 10,000 sons of Naphtali and Zebulun. East Ben Naphtali, Ben Zebulun. So you can see Tabor down there in the south, Kadesh there in yellow is Naphtali, green is Zebulun. They prevail thanks to Jael, a descendant of Moses' in-laws, who drives a tent peg through Sisera's head. Her name means mountain goat. The Song of Deborah in Judges 5 is believed by textual critics to be one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible, which elaborates on the victory of Zebulun and Naphtali while doling out schoolyard insults to the tribes who didn't show. Judges 5:16 and 17. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling of the flocks? Along the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart, meaning they were afraid to go fight. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he stay with the ships? Asher sat still on the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. Schoolyard insults. They're disappointed that some of the tribes didn't help with their oppressors. The contrast is sharp and goes on to praise the troops who risked their lives in answering the tribal summons. Earlier in verse 14, Zebulun is said to carry the Shebet Sapar, which translates to something like the staff used by an officer or a scribe or an accountant. Some might even go so far as to say a ruler or a rule. And I highlighted there at the end, verse 18, Zebulun is a people who risk their lives to the death, Naphtali too on the heights of the field. They're contrasting the tribes that didn't show up when Barak and Deborah called the people to go deliver themselves with God's help and Jael's help from the Jabin's commander Sisera of the Amorites, I think. But that's not all. The story of Gideon also features the heroism of those commando clans. In Judges 6:35, he calls on his own tribe of Manasseh, as well as Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulun, to contend with the Midianites. The place of the battle will be the hill or tree of Moreh. You can see there down at the very bottom, just outside the boundaries of Zebulun, is Mount Moreh. In Genesis 12, this is the site where the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Genesis 12:7. By chapter 7 of Judges, Zebulun disappears and Naphtali takes pride of place at the front of the list of tribes engaged in battle against the Midianites. Gideon's decisive victory, despite overwhelming odds, is seared into Israel's memory as the Day of Midian. It's akin to VE Day for the modern Western imagination. At least that is how Isaiah 9 uses the term. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken, God have broken on it, as on the day of Midian. It's like a tornado of all these meaningful military victories in Isaiah 9. And that takes us back to Jesus and his earthly ministry. After he has prevailed against Satan's temptations, Jesus doesn't simply return home. The decision is deliberate, calculated, part of a strategic engagement with Israel's troubled past. The first thing he does in Luke is read from Isaiah 61 at his local synagogue. But the evangelist, Luke, cuts the prophetic message at a decisive moment. Here's the rest of what Isaiah 61 says. And Luke's version does quote the Septuagint pretty closely. He begins, This is Jesus reading the scroll in his synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives. And the word there is actually aikmalotos. The aikme was a spear. That is literally a prisoner of war. To proclaim liberty to the prisoners of war and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And Isaiah 61 continues. The end of the verse doesn't end until it says, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all those who mourn. We'll talk a little bit about this tendency in the New Testament to defang some of the Old Testament verses, but that's just a little foreshadowing. Matthew also draws upon Isaiah, but a different chapter, and it's heavily redacted. Jesus only started his ministry once, so we have to ask whether the two Gospels are making the same or a very similar point. So let's look at the passages from Isaiah in their own context. So this is Isaiah 9 for Matthew and Isaiah 61 for Luke. Matthew inaugurates Jesus' ministry with Isaiah 9. There will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galil Hagoyim. The people who walked in Hosek, darkness, have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. That's Matthew. In Luke, Jesus begins his ministry by saying instead, the Spirit, the Ruach of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me, Masha, to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the prisoners of war, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to bring comfort, nacham, to all who mourn. Isaiah 9, and by extension Matthew, point out that the land of the commando clans, the region where Jesus grows up, was viewed with contempt. It is ridiculed as Galil Hagoyim, the district Galil Hagoyim, not us. Why might that be? The people associated with that place walk in Hosek, in darkness, the same state from which the cosmos was rescued by God's Ruach Spirit in Genesis 1. What might it mean that the proclamation of good news begins in this dark place? Is a new beginning? And if so, what is it that's happening? Who are these poor, broken-hearted prisoners of war, trapped in gloom and anguish, upon whom God's blessed light has shone? Why might these people be nacham, comforted by the day of God's nacham, vengeance? These aren't rhetorical questions. The Bible gives us hints to concrete answers. As the historically dominant tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali were the nominal leaders of the northern tribes. What I mean by that is that their names are stand-ins for the rest. As the northernmost, they were the first to fall to Israel's enemies, specifically Assyria. Zebulun disappears again, absorbed into its larger neighbor to the north. In 1 Kings 15:20, Ben-Hadad, the son of a foreign god, listened to King Asa and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel and conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Maachah, and all of Chinnereth, with all the land of Naphtali, meaning the entire divided kingdom of Israel, the northern tribes. Again, in 2 Kings 15, verse 29, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured the same cities, plus Kadesh, Genoa, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried the people captive to Assyria. So when he says that, when the text here is saying Naphtali, it's a stand-in for Galil Hagoyim, all of the northern tribes, all of the Galilee, anything that isn't Judah. Once praised for their military prowess, their defeat is particularly stinging. Not unlike another major power's defeat a generation ago. The difference in American military culture between the early and late 20th century, to me, feels eerily similar to the story of Zebulun and Naphtali. After a reluctant entrance into World War I, World War II became our high point, like Joshua's leadership in Canaan and inhabiting the Promised Land. But that confidence turned to arrogance, and the corrupting, forgotten war in Korea paved the way for total loss of moral authority in Vietnam. If the victories of World War I and World War II were akin to Joshua's campaign in Canaan, Korea feels like Judges, and the slow corruption that followed feels like the divided kingdom and defeat in Vietnam. Again, I'm just speaking for myself. But speaking of national defeats, the disgraced military district of Israel has changed hands by the time Jesus hits the scene. So let's talk about how Palestine became Roman Judea and the hands that it had to pass through to get there. And this is where it gets real fun. So the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 587 BCE, the southern kingdom, remember, leading to a 48-year exile. So a whole generation and then some. But that's shorter than I thought. The Babylonian exile is like the Renaissance of Jewish literature and the Psalms and songs. Like a whole lot of stuff happened in that 48 years. In 539, the Persian king Cyrus took control and inspired a Jewish Renaissance by funding Joshua's temple, the second temple. That changed when Alexander the Great of Macedonia seized control in the late 330s and instituted a controversial program of Hellenization. And this is where it gets dicey. The prosperity that Cyrus brought, prosperity gives us time and leisure to think about things, to have opinions, and then for our opinions to diverge. So for the next several years, several cycles, there's a big debate that's happening outside the Bible, but historians, there's no mistake. There's a debate as to whether or not the Second Temple Judaism that has flourished under Cyrus, under the Persian Empire, whether that is good and right and sufficient, or should Alexander's program of Hellenization and progress and economic, prosperity, should that be what we do? And so as the time goes on, there will be this debate through Jesus's time between the Hellenizers, which is what Saul calls them, and we'll say traditionalists. And it begins here with Alexander of Macedonia. He's another relatively benevolent force. He founds cities, he creates some roads, he bolsters the economy. It's not oppressive at all, but it's a different kind of rulership than Cyrus. Cyrus basically was an absentee, daddy Warbucks. Like, he gave him money, just left him alone. That was great. But then Alexander comes in and says, hey, let's get you guys running water, electricity, broadband internet, and everybody just goes buck crazy. And there's this little faction that's like, well, wait a minute. Because as this divide develops, the Hellenizers introduce the idea of giving the temple away to other gods, essentially. There's a number of insurrections, one of which is when one of the Seleucid high priests says, well, what if we just make it a temple to Zeus? And it wasn't a serious idea, but it was enough to kick off the Maccabean revolt. So the Seleucid Empire was founded by Seleucus, who was one of Alexander's successors. And he creates his own empire, and he gains control of Palestine in 201. Then when infighting broke out amongst their overlords, that's when the Maccabees managed to wrest control from them, and the Jews enjoyed a period of pseudo-autonomy under the Hasmonean dynasty. The Maccabees were the traditionalists. They said, get that Greek influence out of here, get the eagle off the temple, all that stuff. They were the hardline traditionalists. And one of the things they did was they made the high priest king of the Maccabean empire, kingdom, whatever. So the high priest and the king were one person, just like in Ezra, remember? But the problem is that they were no longer hereditarily descended from Aaron through Zadok. They weren't biblically legitimate high priests. They were appointed first under the Seleucids, and then they just kept going on. Whoever was in power in Palestine appointed the high priest through Caiaphas when Jesus was there. And that's, I don't know, I didn't hear that much when I was in seminary, but if you're a devout Jew, you would notice when the Aaronic line was broken. The first one was Jason in like 160 something. And it was all about power. You went from anointing all the high priests, the eldest son of the high priest became the new high priest. All that was gone. You saw the second temple, Joshua's temple, but there are these seismic shifts going on. The introduction of eagle, the imperial eagle to the temple, the suggestion that maybe it's a temple for Zeus and make the Greeks happy. All of this is a really big deal. The Maccabees came in and they said, okay, get rid of the Greeks. They were the anti-Hellenizers. And they lasted for about 77 years, when in 63, Palestine became a client state of Rome after Pompey sacks Jerusalem and installs a puppet high priest to serve at the leisure of the governor of Syria and the Herodians. And so when you hear Roman client state, that's the Herodian state. Before I go too far, the Herods were a descended from a group of people that once dwelled in the land of Palestine. They intermarried with Jews, and Herod wanted to be seen as a Jew. And so in, I want to say 37 BCE, he takes Joshua's temple out, even down to the foundation stones. He removes them and builds a new third temple. This is not Joshua's temple. Joshua's temple was plain. It was relatively big, set to the standards set in like Kings or something. Herod's has all the gold inlay and the like majestic white shiny stones and the big court of the Israelites and the court of the everything else in the middle. Like that's Herod's temple. That's a third temple. We know it because all of the foundation stones, Josephus records, all of them were taken away. Nothing was left of Joshua's temple. This is not the second temple. This is a third temple. The Herods, or the Herodians, they take advantage of some of the infighting and they align themselves with Rome, and they basically inherit Palestine when Herod the Great gets in really close with Caesar. And his sons are where we'll start talking about the people who were in power when Jesus was around. But really quickly, we do need to have a crash course on the Roman military. Am I going too fast for anybody? Do I need to slow down, back up? Okay, yeah, that was a lot. I mean, that's something like 500 years and I want to say 3 minutes. But the point that I'm trying to make is it's changing hands constantly. There was this high point, Babylonian exile, the Persian kind of peak, and then, just changing hands, political indecisiveness until we get to Rome. So before we talk about the land specifically, again, we got to talk about the Roman military because there is some misunderstanding. At the top of the Roman military were light-skinned Roman citizen soldiers obligated to a 20-year term, MSO, military service obligation. They had high pay, so they were incentivized, they were rewarded through the spoils of war. They were all but encouraged to extort the locals, and they couldn't marry or take leave, so sex work and other vice economies were common. Latin was their native tongue, and they had to speak Greek in order to make their way around the provinces. And then they received land on veteran colonies after they were discharged. When they were discharged at a veteran colony, or colony really, they were expected to promote Roman culture and train new recruits for about 5 years until they were fully and formally discharged from service. So that was the life of a legionary. You can't marry until you're about 40. And when you do, you have some land, you have some money that you saved up while you're on campaign or whatever. But you don't get to do any of that until you're out. And then when you're out, you still have to train the new recruits at a military colony or veteran colony for 5 years. So below the legionaries or the legionari were the auxilia. These were indigenous recruits incentivized through economic promise. income, food, shelter, clothing, medical assistance, and citizenship after their military service obligation was complete. Now, they had to know Latin to advance professionally. They probably spoke Greek because they are in the provinces. They're not on the peninsula. They're not in Rome. And they're native, but they also spoke their native tongue. And in Palestine, that was Aramaic. The auxilia were primarily used as a police force in remote provinces due to their familiarity with local customs. They were not as mobile as the legionaries. They had families. They had, they were let off at 5 o'clock, and I don't know, I don't think they had weekends. They had holidays, right? So they're not as mobile. So they mostly stayed in place, and for their 20-year service, they acted as the police. They were formally attached to legions. Every auxilia unit had a legion that they fell under. And they could be and were called to battle, but that wasn't their primary focus. They could if they needed to. Then finally, below the auxilia are the numeri. And this is literally the masses. That's what numeri means, the numbers. These are forces loyal to a local sovereign allied with Rome. The emperor could call on them through political alliances, but the rank and file numeri had zero vested interest in imperial culture or incentives. They may not have even known that they could be called on. They're just following their sovereign, their king or whatever, and they're out in the provinces doing their thing. Do you have any questions about Roman forces? And I've given them different complexions on the top because Italians were fairly light-skinned. And at least in Palestine, we're talking about Syrian forces who would have been more dark-skinned, many of whom would have been Semitic. Several of them were Jewish. There's this belief, it's true, Jews were exempted from military service. They did not have to serve. They also didn't have to make sacrifices to Caesar. That didn't mean they didn't do it. The commander below Titus, Titus, who finally goes in to destroy the temple, his second in command was a Jew. I can't remember his name, but it's no secret. In churches, we don't talk about this. We have this idea that, well, the military, our spiritual forebears were exempted from service, and so there's this weird thing about like Christians and priests shouldn't fight in the military. It's like, no. There were there's actually a whole field of study coming out about the Roman forces in Palestine, how many were religious Jews, how many were, and this gets into the distinction between Judean in Roman eyes meant anybody from Palestine. Doesn't matter your religion, could have been pagan out in the Decapolis, which would have been off below that blue area. So Judean did not mean religious to Romans. There was, similarly now we might say like cultural Jews, people who were born Jewish, but who don't practice, right? There's a lot of overlap, a little bit of complexity, but the idea that Jews didn't serve in the military is absolutely false. They were incentivized just like any other Syrian recruits, just like I was, through economic stuff. And so get that out of our head. If you think that Jews weren't in the Roman military, it's false. They know this. Roman historians know this. So in the first century, Palestine was under multiple levels of political control. Local strongman Herod I had solidified power by leaning on his political connections in Rome, but he dies in 4 BCE. Jesus is probably born in 5 BCE because the Gospels record that Herod I was in power at the time, and there's some comment that they know passed through in 5, and that's probably anyway. When Herod dies, his sons inherit his kingdom as well as his forces, the numeri. Archelaus receives the southern Judean plains, including Jerusalem. Antipas was given Galilee to the north and Perea to the east, and their half-brother Philip was awarded the land that Luke calls Trachonitis, up to the north. So Trachonitis is in blue. There's some talk in Luke, because Jesus kind of hovers around the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee, but most of the troops that Jesus would have encountered were these Herodian numeri. Jerusalem was managed by the Sadducees, and these are a powerful handful of families who controlled the temple economy from the high priesthood to the local religious council, the Sanhedrin. As the de facto representatives of Rome in the Holy City, they effectively controlled the Jerusalem cohort. This is also called the temple police, but they're not really. The temple police was a Syrian auxiliary unit stationed at Fort Antonia, and they could be called. And the Sadducees could also, as well as the auxilia, could call on the Herodian numeri to quell the frequent bouts of religious unrest. Insurrection was common at the time because of simmering tensions between these urban elites and the more numerous rural poor. The local procurator was of a senatorial class, the highest class of Roman culture, appointed by the emperor and answerable to the governor of Syria from the provincial capital of Antioch. So Judea was a sub-province underneath Syria. Syria had a governor, and Judea had a procurator, and sometimes they were called proconsuls. The Syrian capital was in Antioch. The local Judean Roman capital was in Caesarea Maritima, where a small unit of legionary, perhaps a century, so 100 men, probably protected the procurator and his palace out there on the coast at Caesarea Maritima. Is that already up? Yeah. That's a guess. Nobody knows for sure. Now, there's some argument when in Luke Acts, I can't remember. There's this reference to the Italian cohort or the Augustan cohort. They may be referring to this century or however many people in Caesarea Maritima who were legionaries, light-skinned, coming from Italy, who are protecting the Roman local procurator, right? Could be, we don't know. The Augustan cohort, which is referred to elsewhere, may be out of Sebaste, which you can see here. The cohors Sebastianorum, there's actually a lot of archaeological evidence that they were there, diplomas from their discharge, equipment. Sebaste was ancient Samaria, renamed. And Sebaste was this, it's complicated, but it means also Augustus. So when you hear the Augustan cohort, it may be this unit, the auxiliary unit stationed in Sebaste, which was, again, the northern capital of the kingdom of Israel was in Sebaste. And there was also a very active recruitment center for Rome there for the auxiliary forces. From 40 BCE to 66 CE, the sub-province of Judea contained a mix of Roman auxilia and Herodian numeri. The Gospels contain no evidence that Jesus ever spent time in Caesarea Maritima. So it means he never experienced or encountered light-skinned, foreign-born soldiers. The vast majority would have been darker-skinned locals serving Herodian interests. Military forces encountered by Jesus and his disciples looked, spoke, and acted in ways similar to them, meaning there was no foreign occupation of Judea when Jesus was doing his ministry. The soldiers that he interacted with were not occupiers. They were local recruits rooted in Semitic customs like his. And before we zoom into Jesus's hometown, let's talk about the battle-born reason that soldiers might get a bad rap in the Gospels. The situation in Palestine was not one of foreign occupation until after the Jewish revolt in 66 CE, when at least 4 legions, or 24,000 Italian troops, destroyed the Jerusalem temple under the command of Titus. The legions historians can confirm participated in the operation include the 3rd Gallica, the 6th Ferrata, the 10th Fretensis, and 12th Fulminata. When the dust settled, Herod's temple was almost utterly destroyed. There's still the Western Wall standing in Jerusalem. And the legions had set up long-term camps throughout the region. The 3rd Gallica went to Raphanea, which is now in Homs, Syria. Did I click on that? There we are. There's the 3rd Gallica. The 6th Ferrata settled in a camp known as Legio, recently found near ancient Megiddo, near Nazareth. The entire Roman legion for some time was settled there, near Jesus' hometown. The 10th Fretensis replaced the Jerusalem cohort. Not auxilia anymore, now they're light-skinned legionaries. And finally, the 12th Fulminata guarded the Euphrates River at Miletus, which is now Malatya, Turkey. And they're actually kind of off map, but not too far. They were within Philip's land, but Philip, Archelaus, and Antipas, all their borders dissolved when Rome came in, exasperated at all the insurrection, destroyed the temple, and set up a more direct relationship with Rome. The Italian cohort in Caesarea and Sebaste fortified in place, but the Herodian numeri were disbanded. Around this time, during the time of the revolt and several decades later, Judea made up less than 1% of the Roman Empire, but housed 8% of the imperial forces. That is a big deal. That is an occupation. That means the Gospels were composed in a far more militarized political environment than the one Jesus encountered during his earthly ministry. Mark, written in the midst of the doomed revolt, reflects strong anti-imperialist sentiment that had triggered the revolt. Luke Acts, appearing toward the close of the 1st century CE, reflects a more moderate Gentile perspective with less attachment to the theopolitical significance of the Jerusalem temple because it was gone. They had to make sense of, well, what do we do now? So back finally to conclude, oh gosh, it still seems early. To conclude kind of over time with Jesus' own home of record. Let's return to the land and the disgraced military district of Israel. The tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali were the defeated troop tribes of Israel, and theirs was a land brought into contempt because, well, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Their oldest claim to fame had been the ancient military leader who arose out of a city called Holy, who helped defeat an overwhelming enemy force. But all that was a long time ago in what seemed like a galaxy far, far away to devout Jews of 1st century Palestine. Jesus is in his beloved military district when he invites Nathanael from the more affluent beach town of Bethsaida to follow him. The recruit is hesitant to associate with a military brat or his hometown, asking, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" In John 1:46. This village is representative of the military district more broadly. We all know that military towns are hubs for sex, violence, and drugs, right? He's implying that Jesus grew up in California's Ocean Slime or North Carolina's Vietnam. The funny thing is, though, that there's no name assigned to the village that Jesus was raised in until Mark's gospel gave it one. So let's think about why that matters. Jesus came out of Nazareth, so it can't be that bad. So what's behind Mark assigning this name in the first couple of verses of our first of 4 gospels? In Mark chapter 1, verse 9, Jesus came from Nazareth or Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Kind of straightforward, just like Mark. And this term Nazareth is inflected, but the uninflected or the root word is Nazareth. It's hidden in fumbled transliteration of a Hebrew word, a root verb, nazar, meaning to consecrate. Does it sound anything like what you've heard before? I'll give you a hint. It appears in Numbers 6 and describes a vow to be made by someone who wants to live a particularly holy life. Does it ring a bell? Nazar? Before Nazareth or Nazareth? Pat, you got one? Doesn't sound like anything to anybody? All right, I got another surprise for you. Nazir, the same consonants form this noun, which means Nazarite. The same consonants also give us another noun, nazar, a consecrated thing, especially a crown that goes on your head, just like the one Joshua the high priest is given in Zechariah's vision. In number 6 of the Greek Old Testament, the root used in place of nazar is hagiazo, to make holy. But the noun, nazir or Nazarite, varies significantly in number 6 of the Septuagint, as though the translators can't quite make up their mind how to render Nazarite into Greek. They use everything from hagnismos, hagneia, and even aphagnisastai. This word doesn't appear anywhere else in any literature, but it's one of these unique forms that means Nazarite. And you can hear the agna, which is derived from hagio or holy, but they're like, what do we do with this thing? There's no word for it in Greek. In several places, the translators substitute in eukomai. The prayers are the people, the prayers of the prayers is this word for the vow of the Nazarite, or the Nazarite who takes a vow, is eukomai. So we'll return to this conundrum for next session when we talk about the kind of faith that Jesus embodies. But for now, I want to leave us with the unavoidable observation that the text seems to suggest as to why Jesus's village is called Nazareth. Remember Barak, the military leader from a Naphtali city called Holy, who with a deliverer, Deborah, wages war on Israel's enemies? It's no coincidence that Jesus is another military leader, this time from a Zebulun city called Holy, who delivers humanity from sin through spiritual combat. In the next session, next week, we'll talk about this divine warrior, his attire and armor, and the combative holiness, kadesh, to which he calls fellow non-combatants. And that, as they say, is all. I aimed for under an hour. I got it. Is there anything we want to discuss, chat about, air out, question, comment? Not all of them. I wanted to just kind of an overview of the topography, because sometimes we forget there's the Jordan River Valley between the Sea of Galilee and the Sea of Jordan. Then there's a coastal plain, and it calls it the Way of the Sea. I don't think the Israelites called it that much. It only appears in the Bible in Isaiah 9. So I think they're taking some license in that map I handed out. But it does have many of the mountains. Mount Carmel was where there's this prophetic showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Mount Gerizim is really important. That's where it's known as the Mount of Blessing, contrasted with Mount Ebal. Gerizim is where Yotam gave his parable of the bramble king, and Abimelech had killed 70 of his brothers, or an exaggeration of his brothers. That was Gerizim. It's also, Gerizim was where the Samaritans worshipped instead of Mount Zion. When the religious elites were carried away to Babylon, the rural poor were left. They were worshiping on Mount Gerizim, and Samaritans do that to this day. When the Maccabees took control, they destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim, centralizing worship at the temple in Jerusalem. And that hadn't been the case. Remember, when there was a divided kingdom, there were 2 temples for the northerners, right? And it didn't seem all that blasphemous that the religiously observant Jews in the north, they had their own temple. They're not going to go down to Jerusalem and worship at Judah's temple. And so the multiple cult sites, there's a battle essentially going on throughout the Bible of, should Yahweh be worshipped at one place for everybody, or are there other places where you can worship Yahweh that aren't on Mount Zion at Joshua's temple? Because remember, when David took power and moved the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle to Mount Zion, and he danced naked, and his wife didn't like it, and blah, blah, blah. Like, it was, the Bible doesn't say I'm to be on Mount Zion. So there's a debate. between what the debate happens to include class distinctions, right? The rural poor is largely in the north, and Jerusalem and some of the larger cities like Jericho is more in the south. But I'm rambling. I want to keep from doing that. Any other thoughts, questions? Oh, we were talking about Gerizim, yeah. So no, that map doesn't have everything. I just wanted kind of a very rough overview of what the land looks like. So when we think of Jesus on his travels, there's mountains, there's valleys, there's hot areas, there's wooded areas. Gerizim, Carmel was wooded. It was almost like, Arrowhead. But other places, were much more arid, especially down south, where Jesus is thought to have taken his 40 days for temptation, was toward the coastal plains, but in a really dry area. Does anybody disagree that it's a particularly martial landscape that Jesus inhabits and calls out to? I feel like Glenn has something he's tumbling around in his head, but I can't tell. No? All right. On Zoom, does anybody have any thoughts, questions, concerns? I want to open up for y'all too. I see Claudia, Jeremy, and Shanna. I told you it's a fire hose, but I also told you I'd keep it under an hour.
So have you been to Israel?
I have. I went I went with it used to be called Christian Peacemaker Teams. Somebody heard of them? They're now Community Peacemaker Teams. As I was getting out, I wanted to, yeah, it's a long story, but I happened to be there while I was still technically on active duty. I was on terminal leave, and the group that had me over there insisted I shave or grow out my beard because they thought I'd be mistaken for Mossad. This is Israeli intelligence, because we took a lot of time to visit areas of Palestine and occupied West Bank. Went down to Hebron. I don't think I went to Nazareth afterwards, but yeah, it's a place. And it is kind of striking. Like, I thought it'd all be deserty, but like the Mount of Olives is, olive orchards still there. Yeah. Nobody has any other thoughts? Put it back. Yeah. Jim.
I don't know the slide this is to compare Isaiah 9:1-2 as seen by Matthew.
Yeah.
Isaiah 61:1-2 seen by Luke. The third over the years that there were really three Isaiah.
Yeah.
So Matthew is looking at first Isaiah and Luke is looking at third.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah. The distinction between so there's Primo Isaiah, Deutero Isaiah, and Trito Isaiah, first, second, and third. It's mostly scholarly distinction. It does seem that first Isaiah is maybe written by someone who was him or was very close to him, like a scribe. And then the second and third are like stories about him that have some evidence that were written later, like events that he wouldn't have known about because he didn't live at that time. So that's the purpose for there being multiple Isaiahs. And that the tone and focus are slightly different. I don't know if Matthew and Luke would have thought in that way. I don't. Say again. Yeah. I don't even know if like the translators, the magical 70 who came up with 70 identical versions, I don't know if that was something that they noticed or cared about. I don't know, but that is a good point. They're drawing from two very different parts of Isaiah.
The 12 tribes seem to fight with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
God's chosen.
Yeah.
Like brothers.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm reminded right after school time, Rosemary and Naomi are, constantly, they're looking to pick fights. So yeah, it's very family. And and I think that's a really apt metaphor for thinking about the difficulties that these texts in the history provide us. Like I was reading Rabbi Jesus, I think it's Bruce Chilton. And he was the first person that I read that suggested that, oh yeah, Solomon was great, but like he wasn't a unifier. Of course, the kingdom divided after that, but like building a big temple has a cost, and who bears those costs? Usually it's the poor. And so it's no coincidence that the northern tribes of Israel, rebel because everybody who has money is giving less of their, like, it's like the widow's mite, like it's all she has. If, a tax of 10 whatever is all you have for a month, like, but it's nothing to people who have a more developed economy in Jerusalem, like that creates divisions. And the inability to communicate or find those find ways around those tensions is where we get this history. I'm still fascinated by the fact that Samaritans were those who had an unbroken relationship with the land, and that's supposed to be good. And yet the Israelites, the line that we think of narratively, destroys their temple as soon as they get back from Babylon. No, I don't think they destroyed it, but it did. I don't think it was used as much. But it was, I know the Maccabees certainly destroyed it. And you see that in the Bible, like the prophets go through and destroy these mountainous cult sites. They're not always to other gods. They're sometimes to Yahweh, but this instinct of centralizing, which, it's like Apple, right? Apple makes all this software, doesn't want all these other people coming in, or they, it's maybe different now. There's this tension between a closed system with less problems and an open system with maybe more problems, but it's more democratic. So that's one of these tensions I just find fascinating in some of these texts.
You talk about being the mountains and the valleys. Other than that, we've got mountains.
Yeah.
And then the Alps. There's mountains.
Yeah. So
the whole film is maybe 1,500 feet.
yeah. So when we were living in Maryland, we were right along the Appalachian Trail. And the pathway went right by our little abbey that we lived in. And there was we were right by a valley, and the one was AT, another one, I can't remember what that ridgeline was. And in between it was called Pleasant Valley. And in Pleasant Valley, and even in Frederick, they would call these ridge lines mountains. I have a house in the mountains, and you can see it like right there. It's 10 minutes away. And I always chuckled, like, there are mountains. Like I could walk up that hill in about an hour, but they're calling it mountain. So it's a relative term. But yeah, if you were born and raised and all you knew was the Levant or Palestine, some of them do, like Mount Sinai, we'd call it a hill, maybe like a speed bump. But like, if that's all you've seen, that's just the language you use. Yeah, Karen. Oh, interesting. I know Arrowhead maxes out at like 6,000 or 7,000 feet. And then the one mountain range to the west, I don't remember what that range is. But yeah, like I went up to Arrowhead. Well, that's where we were Sunday. And you're going up off to the left, there's a much taller mountain with snow on it. I don't remember what it is, but it must go up to 10 or 11,000, I think.
Yeah, it's in the St. Gabriel.
St. Gabriel's, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think like in Maryland, they were, I don't even think they were 1,000 feet, but that was the only word they didn't call them hills, call them the mountains. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Well, again, that's a translation.
Yeah. Well, it's both a translation and a cultural thing. Like, if my girls only ever saw the San Gabriels and they go and hear, you know, Marylanders calling the mountains, they're like, where? What?
Yeah.
But if that's all you know, that's all you know. And that's the word that you give to whatever, right? And here we may have a sharp distinction between a mountain, like Mount Baldy, and then like, you know, the hills, the Laguna Hills. But if these hills are as high as you've ever seen, like hill, mountain, whatever, it's the same.
Lastly, I'm following in Zebulon for the warrior kings.
Mhm.
It sounds from what we heard tonight. Fall of battle king, they're the only ones.
There were others, but their name comes up consistently, repeatedly. So like Asher and Dan.
Are they warriors? Yes, or are they just when I call king, they showed up?
It's a good question whether they were in and of themselves kind of like the warrior class, or if they just had more people who were willing. I would think the latter, because as I think I said in the first session, like warrior, that's not a language that the Bible uses. It's not a value or a virtue that it has in and of itself. So yeah, my sense is that Zebulon and Naphtali were just kind of, you know, a little bit more gung-ho. But when I put up that one slide of like what I think the hosts are, the assembly, the Gibor Hayil are just the most able people, men and women, but mostly men. And then you had the whole Sabah Melchama, the whole military. And then you had everybody who was excluded from the Sabah Melchama, newlyweds, anyone younger than 20, etc. And so there were Gibor Hayil, I'm sure, from many different tribes. I bet I can find examples. So yeah, I think the latter is my sense, is that Zebulon and Naphtali were just kind of like, they were into it, you know. Yeah, they just, everybody, I think, sorry, go ahead.
You hear it talks about 10,000.
Yeah.
How big was an army? 10,000 was shabby considering the population of the time.
Yeah, that was 5 legions. No, there's 6,000. No, that's only 2 legions. So
Division.
yeah. And they are, it's very unlikely it was literally 10,000. They're obviously like rounding out. And in Numbers 2, in that one slide I showed, I should put it in it, but I actually, in another variation of that marching order, I made the boxes smaller and larger, because Numbers 2 gives you the number of people in each tribe down to the nearest 10th, or, you know, tens. And so, you know, you can tell, and I made it all to scale. Judah's real big because it's got the most, and then Benjamin and Manasseh are real small because they have the least. But the numbers are only as reliable. That we should not look to the Bible for the Bible is not attempting to be historically objective or accurate. Well, next week we're going to be talking about faith. I will begin by talking about Nazarites and Nazareth and how that seems to inform Jesus's ministry and where it comes from. Talk a little bit about Nazarites, but especially about Jesus and this town. And there's even a movement that isn't, it's an interesting thing. They call themselves the Nazareans after the Gospels were written, and they claim to be descended from Jesus in the first century and a half. And they all lived out of Nazareth. It's fascinating. But we'll also be talking about the divine warrior, the motif that we find in the Bible, throughout the Bible, most specifically or particularly in Ephesians 6, where we get the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit, boots of peace, all that fun stuff. Talk about where that came from in authentic Pauline literature in First Thessalonians, in the wisdom of Sirach, and then also originally in Isaiah. We'll talk about priestly vestments and how they seem to mirror the divine warrior's armor. And that will be the last thematic session we have before we talk in the conclusion about the transfiguration of Christian soldiers and what to do with all this, which coincidentally, Mount Tabor, where Deborah and Barak did their battle, was where Jesus traditionally, not in the text and not archaeologically, but Mount Tabor is supposed to be where the transfiguration occurred, which is in Nazareth, or Zebulon's tribal allotment. So all of this stuff takes place up in the north. And I'll share an image that somebody put together of all of the major miracles and travels of Jesus. Never goes to Caesarea Maritima. He goes down to Jerusalem, but even when he's a kid and they're supposed to be going to the census, when if the story is true about Joseph and he's descendant of David, they only go into Bethlehem, which is like right on the border of Judah. They don't go all the way in. They just go as far as they have to before retreating back to Nazareth and maybe taking a detour in Egypt. So these distinctions, economic distinctions, crop up repeatedly when you're looking at them, and they intersect quite interestingly with military considerations and elements. So be looking forward to that. I don't have that slide presentation done at all, so that's going to be real fun, but I will try and keep it under an hour. Any alibis, questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Yeah, you're very welcome. I gave this last year and I'm already like refining, and I can see where there's things that I missed last time, and hopefully I'm not overwhelming people now, but yeah, there's been an exercise. And next one, it'll be another opportunity for me to take some of these things I've been finding, sharpening them down and presenting them to people and seeing what everybody thinks. So we have 15 extra minutes. Smoke them if you got them. I'm going to start taking my my costume off and getting ready to go. I might be able to make bedtime. All right, bye everybody on Zoom. I'm going to end the meeting if I can figure out how. See you, Jeremy. Bye, Shanna.